And I'm joined on the line now by Robin Upton from Wikispooks. Now, what is Wikispooks, Robin?
Wikispooks is a wiki, and we're using the same software Wikipedia uses, but it's got a bit of a difference. Our criteria for what is credible material, what is notable.
So, what's the difference between you and Wikipedia then?
Well, Wikipedia says if it's not on telly or in newspapers, well, how do we even know it happened? And we don't want to hear thanks. So the upshot of that is if you can control what's on television and keep something off television, you can also keep it off Wikipedia. And that is playing into the hands of people who have long-established methods of keeping things out of the newspapers or off TV. So Wikispooks says we're going to be critical about everything that gets put here, but just because it's not in newspapers or on TV, that doesn't necessarily mean that it didn't happen. And likewise, Wikipedia has got all sorts of stuff in it which we're not interested in Wikispooks. It's an encyclopedia of deep politics.
So, yeah, we keep hearing these days about the deep state. What is the deep state?
The $64,000 question. Well, it is, first of all, notice that different people use that phrase to mean different things. So one person's deep state might or might not be the same as another person's deep state. I wrote most of the Wikispooks deep state entry, and I define it, first of all, it's loosely synonymous with sort of shadow government. Some people talk about permanent government. The idea that, yes, you're free to choose, put your mark every 4 years, but the actual individual in Downing Street or in the White House might not be the person who's actually calling the shots. So then, of course, the question is, well, who's calling the shots? And that's the subject of deep politics. If there is a group of people behind the scenes organising control over national governments, then that would be the deep state.
Now, you might say, for example, the bankers have got a very powerful lobby. Obviously, they've got almost unlimited funds as well. So you could start, if you wanted to go and actually stare the deep state in the face, go and knock on a few headquarters of banks up in central London. But where else do you think you might knock on the door and find someone who's a deep state operator?
Well, yeah, deep state, they try and, like cockroaches, they sort of hide in the dark. So certainly the deep state needs an ability to stay secret, needs to be able to cover its tracks. So that means, in the first instance, most obviously big media. Not perhaps, you're a former BBC journalist yourself. Did you pick up anything about the deep state while you were working for the BBC?
Not a thing.
Okay. I heard a story about you and the Bilderberg. Did you look in the BBC archives about the Bilderberg group on one occasion?
Never, no, because I only really discovered them after I left the BBC.
Oh, okay. Perhaps I misunderstood that story. So big media, yes, that's involved, but mostly just at the senior levels.
Well, I mean, it's fair to say, I mean, you bringing this up, looking at Bilderberg particularly, because they are one of the most powerful groups in the Western world, really representing the lobby of the big business in the NATO countries, that if you go back even to the 1950s, late 1950s, just after the group was formed, you'll find, on many occasions, actually more coverage in the newspapers in the late 1950s, early 1960s than you will today.
Well, yes. Hats off to, I think this is a subject actually you know better than I do, but I'd say hats off to Charlie Skelton for reporting. And I think the current Bilderberg meetings are actually pretty well attended.
Well, let me just say one little thing about Charlie, because, I mean, he's a comedy writer, really internationally and nationally renowned. Some of the biggest TV programmes, 10 O'Clock Live, for example, he was a script editor on that programme. And he has now found that even The Guardian don't want to commission articles from him. They pay peanuts, so it certainly doesn't give him the make it worth his while financially to even cover these conferences. It's only a very small amount of money he gets from the Guardian US office that has meant that he can still be writing in anything that even resembles a British press. So he's been completely squeezed out. There are other things that he's been working for example, International Business Times, one or two other small outlets. But, the mainstream press in Britain seems to be almost sanitised of any kind of proper scrutiny for Bilderberg.
Well, this is very interesting. Yes, I mean, I have looked for reports about early Bilderberg meetings and been surprised to find them. And I thought, well, more or less the cat's out of the bag on Bilderberg, so they're going to keep having it because it gets things done. But the action, the real hardcore decision-making, the deep politicians are going to be looking for somewhere else to meet up. Now, maybe they're working on recensoring Bilderberg. I'd be interested to see how much play it does get in.
I mean, I think that there's just more and more control of the Western press going on right now. I mean, I witnessed some of this at the BBC in the 1990s, early 90s. You could see things closing down, shutting down. The very best journalists being simply not having their contracts renewed, and programs being taken off the air. I mean, there was just one called Rough Justice, which was looking at miscarriages of justice. We haven't seen anything like that on the BBC for well over a decade now. And the whole thing is becoming a kind of dumbing down process. And the other thing to say about it, I mean, you've got me on my pet subject here, and I'm supposed to be interviewing you, but it's the lack of balance. There's just no attempt at all to give balanced views. I mean, for example, on 5 Live, you'll get the Wednesday morning old Tory fossil slot where every week they have a so-called grandee from the Tory party on pontificating about that day's events. That's invariably somebody that the electorate have voted out of office but has still got lots of money, and so they're able to publish their memoirs and in between golf excursions. And there is no balance. This is the thing that bothers me most about it, is that emphasis has changed from the early 1990s to now, where it really is just a kind of propaganda service where the corporation is putting out a specific government line, including, basically backwards and forwards phone calls. I've heard, personal people have explained to me that phone calls are going backwards and forwards the whole time, all day, between the BBC newsroom and Downing Street. So the Downing Street is kind of micromanaging bulletins.
Yeah. Well, I think this is a reflection of a concern that people's imagination is not being sufficiently captured by the media to which they're exposed. I think when fake news websites, when that phrase came along in 2016, I think it was about November 2016, here's a tip, by the way, one way to sort of get a chronology on when this is introduced. I've been looking at the Wikipedia pages. When do they get created? So that told me, I'm on to one of my favourite topics that sort of tailgates with your thoughts about control over the corporate media. I mean, BBC, it's corporate, it's hierarchical. It's actually going to be fairly easy to control, as you mentioned. Sort of people, you don't need to sort of blow any trumpets, you just fail to renew people's contracts. Or you say, well, we can't pay you for expenses, and you can exert subtle control in those ways. Where the situation's really shifted since the 90s is that people now have the internet that they can use as an alternative source of information. So that has, I think, that's changed the rules in a way that perhaps the powers that be, those people who are quite interested in controlling what gets published and what doesn't get published, perhaps they weren't ready for this. And this thing about fake news website, and I emphasize that not just fake news, which is what we hear about nowadays, fake news websites came along in November 2016, and I think the original story is, you don't want to get things from the internet because any crackpot can put stuff there. So you better just stick to the good old BBC, stick to the TV, stick to the newspapers. You can't just randomly put things in there. That's going to come from an accredited journalist, a professional, somebody who knows their stuff. That was a story about fake news websites. And quite quickly, that got abbreviated to fake news. So the difference there, fake news website, yeah, well, that means you should be using the old media. Fake news is something that anybody can turn out, including newspapers, including TV. So this phrase, fake news website, that was originally, I think, designed, and I don't know exactly who designed it, the deep state, let's call them that. I mean, to return to the matter of who are the deep state, identifying them, it's not a matter of names and faces for me. It is important to try and keep track, such as we can, but it's a loose group, and the names and the faces keep changing.
Well, you talking about the origins of the fake news phrase. In fact, it was Google that launched their fake news application just 2 days before Merkel and Obama over in Germany in November 2016 officially announced the terrible threat of fake news to the world. So in a way, you've got Merkel and Obama doing a kind of press conference, being spokespeople or endorsing Google. That's how bizarre these things are. And of course, Google, if you go back to Google now, you've got Eric Schmidt and his Alphabet company, which owns Google, is on the steering committee of the Bilderberg conferences. So he is now sitting down with Peter Thiel, another steering committee member at Bilderberg, making these kind of high-tech decisions about our future. And it seems that some of our politicians are so witless is that they're prepared to go up and advertise these propaganda ideas for them. Yes.
Well, this fills in some of the blanks. You ask, who else is there on the deep state other than big money? The guys who are in charge of the tech companies, they're in a position of power. So Facebook, all the big data, big capitalism, those organizations have a de facto power. So you want something done, you want some data collected, or you want some software put on somebody's computer, these are the guys you're going to have to get onto. I must mention the intelligence agencies. So-called security services tend to be working for the security of the deep state. If you've got a more or less non-existent system of oversight, as I think most intelligence agencies have de facto, whatever's written down on paper, there may be a committee which has access to these groups, but if the members of that committee are already marked men, if they're in the Bilderberg, if the deep state has got information it can use to blackmail these people, then de facto that has no effect of oversight. So it's a nexus. I mean, Eisenhower talked about the military-industrial complex.
Why don't you just do this on Wikipedia? Surely you don't need your own Wikispooks. You can just create pages on there.
Well, no, you can't, because they'll say, well, this guy, you're interested in him, great, but he's not a notable character. So they remove. I mean, let me think of an example. Peter Jennings, 9/11 witness, was in World Trade Center 7. Said some very interesting things about explosions having gone off, about bodies in World Trade Center 7, and he had a page on Wikipedia. And then they said, well, this is not important. He's not a notable guy. We'll take it out. So they did, and somebody else made it again, and they took it out again, and blocked the accounts. So Wikipedia is a walled garden. If you're contributing to Wikipedia, well, other people might see it or they might not.
Yeah, I mean, I would actually advise people to boycott it, personally. I mean, it's just, for a start, it's doing the sort of... Peter Jennings, actually, is one of the most, key eyewitnesses of the 9/11 attacks, and what he's doing is he's flagging up something which is not part of the official account, which many people now realise is completely fabricated almost from start to finish. And so this is an attempt to control history. This is serious Orwellian fascism almost that is going on at Wikipedia.
It is. You've got to be aware that Wikipedia is not your friendly neighbourhood recorder of how things happened. It is very well presented and it's very well referenced. And I would go so far as to say it's trustworthy on a lot of subjects. Because why do you need to lie about those subjects? Yes, it's an obvious point for PR people and for companies to hit, but it's especially dodgy on matters like 9/11, where that's one of the great lies of our times. So that's really what inspired me to work on Wikispooks, which is to say the software is great, and I like the presentation. It's got a lot of good things there. It's just this little criterion that if the government says something, well, that's beyond question, and if it's not reported in the newspapers, well, it's not worth having on Wikipedia. So those two elements, this trustworthiness, and then this is what's notable, underlie this de facto policy of censorship, which we don't have on Wikispooks. So we've got a variety of material. I mean, it's a much, much smaller user base and much less visited website, but I think it's got real potential. And the whole site is downloadable. It's all open source. We're not making any copyright claims that you have to pay a license. If you want to set up another mirror copy of it somewhere, if you want to just pull out a few thousand pages for your own use, then that's all open. Another thing, we record every history. So every change made to Wikispooks, there's a record when it was made and who made it.
So they do that on Wikipedia, surely?
They do, but they've started, I think this was a couple of years ago, they've started to remove some of the changes. So at the moment, I think you get a record that a change was made and who made it, but you can't see the change.
Oh, okay.
If it's not the current one.
Anyway, it's fascinating. It's almost like this kind of information war going on the internet to kind of control history. But what's your background? How did you get interested in even wanting to create something like Wikispooks? I liked university, and I spent about 10 years at university, and so I was out of the sort of, I heard it called the other week, the iron triangle, out of the real pressure of turning up 9 to 5 and doing a job. So it gave me a lot of time to sit and reflect about what I wanted to do with my life, and I decided to go to a third world country because I wanted to see what the world was like, having spent so long in Britain and a couple of other countries in Northern Europe. And I thought, well, this is actually just only a tiny part of planet Earth. Let's see what life looks like from somewhere else. And so I went to Bangladesh, and I found that I enjoyed the pace of life. It was much slower there. It's very hard to get things done. The wages are much lower there. Well, actually, that worked in my favour, having done some work in the West. So I was in Bangladesh and got a bit of a distance from Britain, from the consumer society, which was already sort of not really floating my boat, as it were. And I enjoyed spending time. I still enjoy spending time with people. The main hobby in Bangladesh is talking. They just sit and chat, and that. It may not be everyone's cup of tea, but I really enjoyed it. I found it a very sort of grounding experience. And one of the reasons, 2003, I was looking after it's why I first heard your name, actually, Tony. I was looking after my granny, who had Alzheimer's in 2003. We just got broadband, and I found access to one particular radio show, actually, and I could download it over the internet. It took quite a while in those days, but I found it very thought-provoking. And the show, of course, I suspect you know this, the show's unwelcome guests. So originally I was just listening to that and not being trained in sort of politics, not much training in economics, not much in sort of ecological matters. I thought, well, this is really something I can learn from.
Didn't understand it all, but knew enough to reflect that these people speaking really knew what they were talking about.
So who were the unwelcome guests in the title of the programme?
The title of the programme was chosen by Lynn Gerry, the American woman who set up the website, actually. It's a website we both know well, radioforall.net, and she chose it just because of the music. But I think her thinking was, well, the speakers, I mean, they had a lot from Michael Parenti, quite a lot from Noam Chomsky in the early shows. These are speakers, Howard Zinn, they know their stuff, but they're not very welcome on corporate media. So let's use the potential of the internet to help these ideas spread a bit wider. So I think that was Lynn's originally what she was getting at when she called it Unwelcome Guests.
Yeah, unwelcome on the mainstream press. So we're in this kind of bind at the moment, though, aren't we, with fake news? Because this is being used to kind of smear real journalists in a kind of propaganda world that we're living in now, where there's very, very polarised, say, for example, someone like Russia Today, almost battling along on the airwaves with one point of view, battling away with the BBC with an opposite point of view. So neither of them really showing both sides of the argument. And I just wonder whether you think what role fake news has in all that, and do you think it's going to succeed as a term to sort of turn people off from watching corporate media?
Well, I think no. Actually, I think it's backfired, because their original thought, fake news, come from these fake news websites, which just use clickbait. They put up some fake stories and expose ads to people, and that's how they make their money. That was the original phrase, and it was just easier to talk about fake news because news isn't confined to websites, and if you hear news from one source, you can put it on another source. So always concentration about fake news. Now, people who are reading the newspaper, people who are watching CNN. I mean, Venezuela kicked out CNN, saying you're a source of fake news. Well, they're not a source of fake news websites, so it's really, I think it's actually focused people's attention on, do I believe this? Where do they get their information from? And a lot of people, I think people who had already drifted from television and the newspapers, why do you seek out the internet? Probably you're already quite skeptical about what you're being told. So I think those people were quite wise to the idea of fake news already. I think the upshot of the whole fake news debacle is currently that it's switched a lot of people on who are watching TV and reading newspapers to the fact that they might be being consistently lied to. So in summary there, I think this is actually a step in the right direction. I think that you're right, they are looking at fake news checkers. They would love to automate this process so that if you post something on Facebook which, say, agrees with CNN, well, then all your friends are going to see that and it'll be pushed up the news feeds. And if you have a more critical take, then they'll flag that up in software, because, of course, they can't have armies of people. I mean, they want to try and do the Chinese method, have armies and armies of censors, or the Stasi. Well, they could try, but it's so much more efficient to have software automatically spotting dissident view. This person's used the keyword too many times. Let's flag this up as fake news. But it is, of course, incredibly difficult to actually write an algorithm that's going to parse human language. When you think about all, the fact that I could say something to you and be sarcastic, and a computer will just do a text.
Well, you don't tend to get very much on that on the American media. That's almost all literal. So maybe their fake news software won't work over in Britain. Anyway, look, the biggest fake news ever, surely, was the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq.
Well, if you want to overlook 9/11, yeah. But, I mean, we're not short of fake news. More or less, I mean, how many wars can you think of which didn't start with a piece of fake news?
Well, you saying that, I mean, they've just had all this stuff to do with North Korea and launching, every month or so there's another missile test, which is the Americans now, Rex Tillerson, the former chief executive of Exxon, banging his fists on the table. I mean, as an example, just forensically looking at that story, you've got Tillerson saying that this is a new threat to the entire world. Well, the thing went, I think it was 930 kilometres. So what's that, about 600 miles? And it could only just about reach Japan from North Korea. And on the BBC, they were reporting that this missile can reach the mainland of the United States, exaggerating it, because it's about 5,000 kilometres to Alaska and probably 7 to mainland United States. But this thing only went 900 kilometres. So you can see that there is almost everything to do with the potential future conflicts is we're being lied to. We
are. It's scaremongering. It's the 45 minutes to weapons of mass destruction.
And the question is, the journalists should, at that point where that government statesperson, whoever they are, makes that factual error, should we politely call it that, then they should be pulled up by journalists, and that is just simply not happening. There is it seems they are fazed by the power of the people in politics to just simply not ask questions, not do their job. So I guess that's where this kind of fake news ends, is at that point where you just end up with, instead of journalism, you've got a kind of stenography where you're just copying what the government is telling you and putting it out on the mass media as if it's a fact.
Well, I am expecting, I was expecting this year to see a rollout of internet censorship, because they're having trouble dealing with people's free expression. They want to close down these conversations. I haven't yet seen a great level of internet censorship. They may be having a rethink, but if that is their game plan, just to try and just shut up everybody, we've got to close down this dialogue, I think they're likely to fail, because people want to have these conversations, and because technology is making it easier and easier to exchange information. And as you say, I mean, the corporate media is full of lies, and people are busy. They haven't necessarily, they're not keeping tabs on this.
But it's a bit more sophisticated, surely, Robin.
YouTube.
It's a bit more sophisticated than that, because 90% of what the mainstream press is telling us is the truth, because it's about stories that don't affect those key issues that the deep state wants to affect. It's just when we get, say, something like this North Korean missile launch, it might be the only story in the week which has got so much so many lies and spins on it. Yeah, well, what I'm saying is
everybody more or less knows that they were lied to about Iraq now. I think 9/11, you and I and the people that we hang out with more or less know what a pack of lies that was. There may be lots of people who don't, but the truth is only one YouTube video away.
Yeah, but can you just detail what you think of the basic... I mean, you say lies. I mean, what are you saying is a lie about 9/11?
Well, they claim that it was 19 Muslim hijackers who were organised by Al-Qaeda under Osama bin Laden in a cave. And it's hard to know where to begin with that story, because there's so much more to it. I would suggest that it was worked out decades before, planned by people whose aim was to make money, but particularly to amplify their control by bringing in a whole new bunch of laws and using fear to suppress people's rational capabilities, making them become childish and dependent upon the government to protect them from these terrorists. It really launched the war on terror, which is still ongoing, and that's one reason why I've got no time for somebody who says, well, that was 9/11 was years ago, let's move on. No, if our world is still being shaped by this supposed war on terror, a pretty farcical name if you ask me, I generally use that with air quotes, if that is based on a lie, as I believe it is, then we need to get to the bottom of it.
Fair enough. Also, Wikispooks, for anyone that's never used it before, what's one of your favourite pages on there?
Well, the 9/11 page, since we're talking about it, there is quite a lot of information on 9/11. lots of aspects of it. They're all broken down into separate pages on Wikispooks. So we've got one page for the Pentagon, we've got a page for the hijackers, we've got a page for World Trade Center 7, and then, World Trade Center 7's got sub-pages about the demolition. I mean, in case your listeners haven't heard, the BBC is one of several corporate media outlets who announced that the building had collapsed before it had collapsed. Very interesting, and if I was an investigator really trying to get to the bottom of this, I would seize upon that and say, well, what's going on? This is surely not something that happens. And these various commissions,
just to pick up on that one Jane Standley quote, isn't it? And she was on BBC World talking about that. You do wonder whether there's someone sitting at the BBC with a script that they're running through. So events like this are effectively almost like theatre, scripted events.
Yes. I think they are scripted. I think they're worked out. People have already got statements prepared. If they know that this is going to happen, and I'm sure that some of the people interviewed were quite ready, and they had thought out what they were going to say, then I would encourage people to go to Wikispooks, look at the 9/11 page, and follow their curiosity. We've got about 15,000 pages on the website, and maybe we've got about 30 or 40 about 9/11. As I often do on Wikipedia, I just get curious and I sort of see where curiosity takes me. We have got almost every page on Wikispooks, which has an analogous page on Wikipedia. Some people have been censored, so you can't do this from the Peter Jennings page, but you can click. It's one click away to have a look at the Wikipedia version.
And how do people register? How easy is it, Robin?
You just have to go to wikispooks.net, and that it's a read-only website until you've made a login. We used to allow anonymous people to edit it, and I would like to do that, but the reality was we just had so much spam and people trying to sell us stuff that it was very. It took it was a full-time job basically, just cleaning it from vandalism and spam. So I'm afraid you have to to register if you'd like to become an editor, and then you've got to click on Make Me a Login, and you put in a username and password, and you put in your email address, and it'll email you an account, and depending, I have to approve it, or one of the other administrators has to approve it, but it usually doesn't take more than a day or so.
And you might learn something too.
Well, I find it's very helpful to consume media. When I'm reading things, I half the time I put the interesting bits on Wikispooks, because you read a story, you read one page on the internet, you say, well, that's interesting. I wonder what supporting references there are. Yeah, these days, if they're referencing documents, if they're talking about documents, but they're not giving you the documents, why not? Because they could be. If the documents are out there, it's just a matter of putting the URL, give people access to the original material, and they can make their own conclusions. And I would think every creditable journalist would try and do that.
The trouble is, of course, a lot of creditable journalists, supposedly creditable, just look up Wikipedia. They ignore Wikispooks. Anyway, look, Robin, lovely to talk to you. Thanks very much for joining us on Dialect.
Thanks very much, Tony.
That's all for this week. Dialect's Bristol's first weekly podcast. If you're online, you can subscribe to our emails or download the podcast from dialectradio.co.uk. Thanks to our guests, musician David Mowat, who's doing Longing, Belonging and Balfour on Thursday at 7 o'clock at Henley's United Reformed Church, and also to Robin Upton, the creator of Wikispooks, also to studio engineer Dave Bazanko. Dialect's a Bristol Broadband Co-op production. Catch us on Bristol Community FM 93.2 every Tuesday at noon, and anyone can contribute. Contact us through the People's Republic of Stokescroft, just off Jamaica Street, at prsc.org.uk. Also through the National Volunteering website, that's do-it.org. That was Dialect, and I'm Tony Gosling, wishing you a very good week. Thanks for listening. Till the same time next week. Goodbye for now.